anything to say about the deindustrialization of this country.
Georgian townhouses on the moon, the highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way. Small modular reactors under every village green. This is Anglo-Futurism.
Hello and welcome to the Anglo-Futurism podcast. I'm Tom O.
And I'm Callum Drysdale. And despite what many a 7-year-old will tell you, up here in lower Earth orbit, we can't actually see the Great Wall of China. But what we can see is Jungnan Shipyard. From our thatched space station up here, we've observed that China is currently producing 230 times more ship tonnage than even the US, let alone countries like Britain.
The battle for the 21st century is well underway and the West is falling behind.
But we have some good news. Teams of American uber nerds have teamed up to produce a plan that could just save the West.
It's our pleasure today to welcome Santi Ruiz, one of the editors of the Techno-Industrial Policy Playbook. Santi is here to talk about the playbook, its ideas, and what Britain can learn from them. He arrived at our orbital thatched cottage a little earlier, having got here in a massive American rocket that took up 3 parking bays.
Santi, welcome to the show.
Thank you, fellas. Good to be here. I will note that uber nerd is not actually the term of art. In America, we say policy entrepreneur or wonk.
Oh, policy Chad.
Before we begin, Santi is also the author of the Statecraft newsletter and the host of the Statecraft podcast, which our producer absolutely loves. We will link to both in the show notes.
Let's jump in. The key question of the playbook, it seems, Santi, is one of the ownership of the 21st century. Who will be ahead, the US or China? Could you give us an idea of what you think the relative positions are, please?
Yeah, happy to. So the author of the foreword, my friend Kelvin Yu, did a very good job, I think, outlining some basic facts that are easy to, or maybe it's nice to ignore them, which is that Americans often have a sense that we're the world's leading technological and industrial power, and that was clearly true up until a point. But in the last 10 to 15 years, it's at the very least no longer clearly true. You could still make that claim, I think, more easily on the technological side than on the industrial side. But China has an incredibly contestable case and quite plausibly is ahead of us, in particular when you look at manufacturing capacity, but also not just at the manufacturing end. I think there's also an American idea that what China adds to the manufacturing chain is the little plastic crap or the screws in the iPhones, as one of our political leaders put it recently. But actually at all levels of the value chain, including at the very high levels, that the Chinese have actually completely lapped us, and that technical expertise and increasingly scientific research in some ways are at the bleeding edge in China more than they are here in the US. Kelvin focuses quite a bit on manufacturing capacity, that we can't make a lot of things here in the US that are really essential in a warfighting capacity and also just kind of in a basic civilizational capacity. None of us would like to go to war with China. We're all big fans of traditional deterrence, but increasingly it's not obvious that we would win a war and thus that we're able to conventionally deter China if we would like to.
Well, what might happen if the West or America went to war with China?
Yeah, I spoke to Dr. Jeffrey Freeman recently on Statecraft. He leads a team Congress is tasked with studying what's called the National Disaster Medical System, which is a system that would coordinate private hospitals with the Army and the military in the event of a hot war with a great power competitor. his prognosis was quite bleak of 1,000 casualties a day for 100 days, for the first 100 days in the event of a hot war. And that's the point estimate. The error bars are wider, obviously. I also spoke recently to a member of Congress who sits on the House Foreign Affairs Committee who is confident the U.S. would win a war with China. At least that's what he will say in these private conversations. But obviously, it would be catastrophic likely for both sides in the event that it happens. I think we could get into the Taiwan scenario specifically, but I think there's every indication that there's risk of hot war on the horizon, and that one that the U.S. is not prepared for.
And what's striking about the playbook is that it's, as you said, a collaboration across a few think tanks. And it rather gives us the impression on this side of the pond that DC's not quite on a war footing, but wiggling its foot in the direction of that footing.
Well, we can get into it. I think much of the playbook is focused. I'm framing it in terms of great power competition, but a lot of it, and the forward, is very clear about geopolitical competition with China. But we think that there are a variety of reasons that you should want to rebuild American technological and industrial capacity. Even if you're a firm believer in soft power or in technological diffusion as a tool for geopolitical dominance, those are things you need a robust techno-industrial base to achieve. The organizations that collaborated on this, they do come from quite a wide range politically, and we made quite clear we do not agree on everything. There's different views on the efficacy of tariffs, on some of the organizations are partisan. IFP, the Institute for Progress, my home organization, is nonpartisan. But we all agree on this kind of core instinct that the America's techno-industrial base is really essential to rebuild, and that has not, I think, been orthodoxy in American policy for a long time. And even today, I think you get lip service there, but there's a real gap in seriousness between how, say, the Chinese approach this question and how we do, even if the tools to achieve techno-industrial power would look very different in those two countries.
I mean, it is notable, though, right, that the Institute for Progress, which makes its name on things like high-skilled immigration and biosecurity and meta-science, is thinking about questions of national conflict, of maybe even existential questions. Like it maybe reflects the mood, right, in America.
I think that's plausible.
When did you get based, is what Callum was asking.
We think meta-science is very based, Callum. Well, the playbook is broken up into into three different sections, and each of the think tanks took a leading role in putting them together. So the section on frontier science and technology is firmly in our wheelhouse at IFP. We think that there's a pretty basic linkage between this upstream science and technology experimentation and downstream industrial output. And in fact, that the more you're producing physically, the tighter linkage you have to feed new information back into your scientific ecosystem. So we think there's benefits in both directions there. The Foundation for American Innovation led the national security section, which is a little bit more defense-focused explicitly, weapons testing, that sort of thing. And then American Compass, which is, I think you would call more of I don't know if traditional new right is an oxymoron or a contradiction in terms, but more clearly aligned, I think, with the administration and with maybe the Vance wing of the administration, focused on the industrial power section. So American workforce rebuilding, some energy reform work, et cetera. So we think there's a sweet spot in the Venn diagram there, even if I would disagree with my friends at American Compass over the efficacy of tariffs, for instance.
And just to give listeners a flavor of what's coming up, we're going to talk about frontier science labs, abundant energy, and how America might make it more plentiful. We'll also touch on elements of national security, such as reforming naval shipbuilding. But before then, a very important question. How, if at all, is Britain relevant to this conversation?
Well, we wrote this playbook trying to be very clear. We want to borrow and steal Chinese seriousness about techno-industrial capacity. We think that they have a attitudinal approach, and their policymakers have an understanding that these questions are paramount that American policymakers don't. But what we want to be very clear on was that does not mean you want to borrow the forced labor or the slave labor, the Chinese model, or the rampant tech theft, or the kind of disdain for for free markets, right? There's a lot of the basic idea was, what can we take from the Chinese model that's actually applicable to the strengths of American society, our incredibly liquid capital markets, our fantastic university research ecosystem, for instance, to name two. And I think the recommendations that you see here in the playbook are tailored to American strengths. We're not trying to create a kind of Sino-American fusion in this playbook. A lot of these strengths aren't just distinctively American; they're strengths that are Western. And I think, to your point, the UK has a remarkable research institution apparatus. It has functioning capital markets, very good venture ecosystem for Europe at the very least. And so I think there's probably a lot that can be borrowed from this playbook for British purposes. I think the question I would turn around to you is, we're framing this as a feature of great power competition, as a question. We're posed a question by the rise of China. I don't know if that you're posed the same question, or if the motivation to do techno-industrial policy may have to come from elsewhere.
Well, I mean, it's I think an interesting thing for us to experience, right? Because we have for so long made ourselves known in Washington as like the yappiest lapdog, the most excited to get down on our knees and celebrate whatever scraps like America wants to throw us. So I think I think what is interesting about it is, as America starts looking at, starts being potentially challenged and faces, something of an existential challenge, and also, maybe not existential, but we touched on Taiwan and the question of that. Taiwan is very much a lot easier for China to sort of grab, right? It's just on their front doorstep, than it is for America to defend. And there's, I think that's the real question for us, is when and if, hopefully if that happens, does the US come calling to us and say, right, come on, we want the 2 aircraft carriers deployed and we want soldiers, right? Like, I think that's our real interest. And the question is, are we going to be like grunts, or are we going to be a high-powered, potential useful ally?
Sure. And I think, Tom, your colleague Eris Rusinos at Unheard has written quite a bit making the opposite case, right? That it's not in Britain's interest to be as you put it, America's lapdog, or to be joined at the hip, the special forces friends of the American empire. I think if the UK wants to exert power in Europe, I think if Russia is kind of the paradigmatic great power threat that the UK faces, whereas our attentions over here in America are rather split between Eurasia and East Asia, maybe it even makes sense to just orient your techno-industrial policy around the Russian and the European question. And I think there's a realpolitik argument for that. That the point of rebuilding Britain's techno-industrial base is not to be ready when we come calling over here on this side of the Atlantic, but it's that you have your own interests independent of what the Americans would like you to think.
Yes, and perhaps we can learn from the playbook in some respects. So I'm going to hand over to Callum to ask you about frontier science and technology, which is one of the 3 main sections in that playbook.
Well, Santi, I mean, the ones that I liked and I think are relevant to Britain are these ideas of X labs. And maybe, do you want to explain what X labs are, and then we can talk about what it would mean for both the US and potentially, allow us our venture into the UK, what that would mean for the West.
The X Labs proposal is from my colleague and boss, Caleb Watney, and I think it's a meta-scientific topic that we've been thinking about for a while at IFP. Currently, the 2 major funding institutions for science in the US are the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and the NSF, the National Science Foundation. You can complain about different features of both of them, and we've made our policy criticisms, but they're really robust, remarkable funders of science. And I think that the Trump administration is realizing, after trying to slash some of those grants, that a lot of those grants are incredibly valuable for the American scientific apparatus, let alone the global ecosystem. But one failure mode of both those institutions is it's much easier to apportion money from the NIH and the NSF to research universities, to institutions of higher education, than it is to things that are not shaped like universities. But increasingly, we think a lot of the cutting edge biomedical research, some of the material science research, a lot of the AI enabled research is going to be happening not in traditional higher ed institutions, but in new forms, whether that's focused research organizations or whether that's things like the ARC Institute, entities that have been stood up by tech money that lure scientists away from these kind of more storied institutions. Currently, the funding mechanisms that the federal government has, it's very difficult to disperse money from them to those institutions, and we want to make sure that the median R&D dollar in the U.S. is maximized, that we're spending it on places where the highest impact science is happening. So the proposal is to develop a kind of grant from the NIH and from the NSF where you reallocate some of the money that you might have been spending elsewhere to these institutions that are doing really novel, high impact research.
And particularly, right, because it's not that you're allocating it to individual people or to groups that are led by individual researchers. I mean, I don't know to what extent our listeners have experience of academia and research, but this tends to happen, right, in individual person, like single person led labs, and they assemble postdocs and PhD students under them. And this has been worked for a while, and this has been successful. But the argument that you're making is science just doesn't work like this, and you can't achieve your goals you want by keeping on with this traditional but not necessarily that efficient method, right?
Well, I want to temper that a little bit. I think I'm quite bullish on the PI model generally, and I think if anything, we've pushed at IFP to allocate more towards person-based grants and less towards project-based grants. That is, if you're a really fantastic researcher and you've got a track record of cutting-edge science that's kind of above the median, we should think seriously about giving you a pot of money agnostic of the specific project that you're coming to us on. So I'm definitely not opposed to that part of the traditional model of a PI, a principal investigator, and a bevy of people under them. I think there's real questions both about how quickly and how effectively traditional universities are going to integrate AI into their workflows in ways that will keep them at the frontier of science. If you were building new research institutions from first principles to try and accelerate high risk, high reward basic science in fields like biotech or next generation energy or chronic disease research, you probably would not set them up the way they've been set up inside a lot of traditional higher ed institutions. And so those are taking different forms. XLab, these X grants would be selected through a competitive review process. We want them to be independent research institutions. But yes, the idea is you'd have a long-term, flexible block grant, a lump sum to these innovative organizations outside of a traditional academic setting.
There's an interesting dynamic here, right? Because what the country needs is progress on a specific goal, i.e., we want to be the best at stealth technologies for, sixth, seventh generation fighters. So we want a material that is able to absorb or scatter radar, which does feel like it is somewhat in conflict with this individual-led process. And I think that what was quite interesting was here in the UK, the government set up the Turing Institute that was meant to be our great AI institute, and had real problems in herding this group of cats who didn't really want to go and do what they were told, right? I suppose it requires a really different way that researchers see themselves, not as individuals, but as part of a team that can achieve a goal.
I don't know if I'd accept that framing wholesale. I mean, let me think on that. But I think a lot of what we really want is progress in high risk, high reward basic research. Not necessarily, we don't necessarily know in advance that we want a new, skin for the new jet fighter, especially. I think we know we want advances in material science, for instance, and we want a much better understanding of that. It just might be that in those basic research areas where we know that the sector is a national priority, but we don't have a specific target in mind, that the institutions that are going to make a lot of progress on that sector might be like a focused research organization where it'll exist for 5 years to try and push forward the frontier on some really important basic research. It'll take a lot of capital to do that work because whatever electron microscope or other hardware is quite intensive, and we know that generally speaking, these as the frontier of science expands, it's harder to for you and me in our garage to come up with a breakthrough. Often the capex is really remarkable, or the physical inputs are quite robust.
Skill issue, Santi.
Yeah, my garage maybe, yeah, but yours is steaming ahead, right? And it may just be that the kinds of, as you say, right, the kinds of organizations and the team structures that we want for this kind of high risk, high reward research don't exist in universities. They exist in other forms, and we should maybe even think about using these kinds of grants as a pull mechanism to bring some of those new entities into existence, which currently can't grab the kinds of funding you'd like to.
Yeah, and you say you don't want to, follow the Chinese model, but it does seem that you need, there needs to be this clear sense of a national interest, right? That, and I think maybe we talk about the special compute zones as well here, but I think there's quite an interesting phenomenon that takes place in a lot of the playbook, where a lot of the solutions involve like carve outs in regulations. So, in the special compute zones, they carve out against the was it NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, to allow faster building of power and building of compute clusters. Maybe you want to lay out what these compute zones are, and then we talk about like the challenges that are involved behind that.
Sure, happy to. Just the last point, I'm gonna double back and argue with you yet again here, Callum. But I'm not convinced that the things like the X Labs or most of the set of frontier science and technology proposals in here are about articulating a really clear national goal and pulling people into it. For instance, on the research side, there's quite a few organizations popping up on the West Coast, and I'm trying to avoid naming some. So, we're not saying any specific one is the future, that the federal government should fund Future House or the Arc Institute, any one of these specific organizations. But a lot of these organizations are doing fantastic biomedical research work, or they're figuring out how to get better results out of AI scientists than we've seen so far. And they're doing that without X Labs already existing, right? I tend to think people have a pretty good sense of what's important research. We just haven't incentivized, we haven't maximized like the potential of the stuff that's happening outside the universities. And I think this might be something applicable, especially to the British context, because even more so than the US, my understanding is that quite a large chunk of government research dollars flow through the higher ed system in the UK. And I think a big chunk in both of our countries goes through higher ed, and there's real value to those systems. You wouldn't want to dismantle them, but it's probably worth thinking about what kinds of things are not especially easy to do within those existing systems.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, right? Our universities are good at innovating and then very bad at commercializing. And I think, but I hear what you're saying about there isn't a national goal, but I still think, and you touch on it elsewhere about things like the national security, right? The security needed in frontier AI labs, that these labs have potentially been somewhat naive in not being considering the risk of espionage and counter-espionage and having sufficient counter-espionage set up, right? There's clearly a case here where if they're not thinking in a national way, other people will think nationally and will exploit that, right?
Certainly. And I definitely think, at IFP, we're big believers in, just the concept of public goods. There are certain things that the markets won't provide. We're big fans of markets. We just think there are certain sectors where you can clearly say it's not going to happen. Security of frontier research labs, AI research labs, is absolutely one of them. And I should just caveat, I'm a generalist here, so I'm talking about the work of my colleagues. And I hope I'm doing them a service and not a disservice here. But absolutely, the one of the proposals in this frontier science and technology section is about special compute zones. And the idea is that there's a grand bargain that the federal government can achieve with the hyperscalers. They need abundant energy. They need it quickly. And there's a lot you can do on the regulatory side to carve out specific areas that have been kind of pre-selected, sites on which you'll allow, whether it's natural gas plants or geothermal or nuclear building, and you'll expedite the permitting review and the regulatory barriers there. And what you would ask for in exchange from these hyperscalers is certain commitments to infrastructure security, to making sure that these sites aren't being hacked, that they're not. I mean, this is a egregious example, but they're not, including Huawei components in the infrastructure of those sites, and that they're just, providing information about the basic internal AI safety and security of those of the models they're building with those training runs at those sites. So we think that's a really specific case where you do have a grand bargain. The companies are not going to do that on their own, but they would be totally happy if they and everybody else in the sector were, asked to comply with certain rules, but they're not going to provide that security guarantee to the level that you need from a national security perspective on their own, absent public power.
Over here, Santi, I'm going to disgust a man from the Institute for Progress, but it takes 15 years to connect a power station to the grid in our country.
I'm inured to this sort of thing. On your side of the pond or mine, I can take it.
But what kind of turnarounds do you think you could get for a power station of this kind, for a hyperscaler in the US under this plan?
It depends whether you're talking about natural gas, which we are very, we know how to build, and which would have been less favored in the last administration and is very much on the table in this administration, versus other forms of clean power. I'll just say that we have a couple proposals in here about expediting both the nuclear build out and geothermal exploration, which I think both of those are clean, firm baseload power that we would love to see more of. I don't know if we articulate a specific timeline on which you could pull this together. Obviously, it depends both on the permitting side and on the individual private companies, but we think it should be a question of months, not of multiple years, and God forbid, decade and a half.
Months? Bloody hell! I think you misspelt years. Well, this is a
maybe double digits of months, to be clear, but that should be the unit of counting.
Well, this is a good point to ask you about energy reform then, because that, of course, is an important part of the plan. And you were talking to us earlier about the Loans Programs Office, which is much sexier than it sounds, isn't it?
It sounds horribly boring, doesn't it? The LPO, as it's known, is an arm of the Department of Energy here in the U.S. that provides, as the name suggests, loans to new energy technologies in particular, although it's got a pretty broad remit. This is one place where we push back on the administration, or at least pointed out that there's a discordancy between certain goals of the administration and other goals. So DOGE, led by Elon Musk, has pushed to reduce the number of people at this loan programs office by more than half, and quite a few people have already taken the buyout. So, I can't remember what exactly the percentage is, but a substantial chunk, if not the more than half that DOGE has been asking for, have already left the loan programs office. And there's also been interest in the House of Representatives in reducing the power of the loan programs office to administer new loans and to focus it entirely on administering its bevy of old loans. So the office provides key energy projects with financial assistance, right? So under the Biden administration, it focused on, as you'd expect, more classically green technologies. You had some interest in hydrogen, in a variety of green tech. And I think that's caught the ire of some people in the administration. Of course, the problem is every new nuclear build in America in the 21st century, bar one, it exists thanks to a loan from the Loan Programs Office. And that one that didn't get a loan from the LPO got it from the Tennessee Valley Authority, another federal government entity. It's just quite implausible that you're going to see a nuclear renaissance, which is an administration goal, right? That you're going to see energy abundance in this country if you hack away at the tool, one of the most effective tools that we have for it. So there's an excellent piece in that, in the playbook from a guy called Emmett Penny, who's at the Foundation for American Innovation. And his push is, don't destroy this thing, which is a remarkably effective tool for remarkably cheap, because the majority of these loans get paid back. Use this tool to allocate a bunch of its statutorily obligated money to new nuclear build out and just focus it on things that you're going to want in a long-term perspective and try and drive down the cost curve there.
As you know, Santi, because I wrote a report for you on this last year.
An excellent report.
Well, thank you very much. We'll put that in the show notes. This is a report on the US government's geothermal field lab, known as Forge. And I find the geothermal world very interesting, partly because it seems to make a good case, or it might make a good case. We'll have to see over the next few years for government investment. And it might not come through the Loan Programs Office, but an example that I really like is that of Quaise, which is, as studious listeners of the show will know, the American startup that is trying to drill very deep to access high heat by using a millimeter wave, which is basically a transparent laser. And it seems an unalloyed good that innovators in the States could get hold of government investment such that they can not only sort of spam out nuclear power plants, which we know how to build, but also develop the clean energy sources of the future.
Absolutely. Geothermal is one of these areas where, if anything, it suffers from being such an obvious bipartisan win. I think sometimes if it's not conflictual and full of tension, people are just less interested in it. There's no good reasons not to support geothermal energy, and as a result, it's kind of who's supposed to champion it. But you're right; it's a sector that could use not just federal investment, but you kind of see this throughout the policy playbook, that there are sectors where you want some public investment, certainly, but you also want regulatory reform. You want to free companies to do what they do best, and you want some private sector mobilization. You want to align incentives for companies to explore in areas where, if you believe in the promise of geothermal, that the Earth produces remarkable amounts of heat below the surface. I'll give the quick spiel, right? That there's fundamentally limitless energy within the Earth's crust. The techniques to access it, in large part, borrow from the existing oil and gas techniques we already have. You drill a big hole in the ground and you stick a thing down it and you translate the heat up to a turbine, etc. And that we're a little too far away from commercialization for this to be a sector that private companies or that private investment can pour money into. And in some cases, that's because of a regulatory environment that makes the returns to these investments too far out in the future. It's not necessarily because the technology will never work. It's because you'll only find out if it works after your LPs demand the money back. It's a perfect place for targeted policy, not just investment, not just pouring money at the problem, but reducing the regulatory barriers to getting your environmental permitting for geothermal wells. And I'll just flag, not that this will be relevant to the British listeners, but a fact that really pulled me into this in the first place, which is that oil and gas wells, the same kinds of physical disruptions in the Earth's soil, already get these remarkable carve-outs from the American environmental review process. They already get the fast track, and it's the geothermal wells, the fully clean, firm energy, that do not. And so there's just a lot of kind of pieces of low-hanging fruit, at least in the American policy ecosystem, where it should not take a heavy lift to get some big bipartisan win.
And we had John Clegg on the podcast, actually, who leads Hefe Energy, which is building the electronics for doing these kind of drilling and for geothermal power. I think, again, what's interesting, though, there is this recognition, again, that there are basically difficult, obstructive regulations at that lower level, and you just need to achieve like these carve-outs, right? Like, and we had an interview recently with someone a guy, Joe Hill, who has this idea of everythingism, that every policy tries to achieve every single goal, and thus they fail in achieving any of them, right?
I just want to interject, kind of, as you might know, Santi recently did a podcast about what Americans can learn from British state capacity, which obviously makes us hoot with derision over here. But Joe Hill is a great priest of improving British state capacity.
He's excellent.
But I'm just interested whether you have an answer for that. Like, where does that come from?
Where does what come from?
These, like, that these carve-outs are already, these carve-outs are recognized as necessary because without them, things don't really occur, and the systems are not like economical.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a object level answer here, and then I think there's a broader answer here. On the object level, it makes total sense that the oil and gas industry gets a carve out because it's a much older industry and it has a small army of lobbyists. And I'm sounding like a a green environmentalist here, but it's obviously true, right? This industry has had massive money behind it for more than 100 years. Geothermal is relatively new, and so it doesn't have that foothold in DC to play the game and get the carve outs that it would like. On a but on a broader level, and my friend Thomas Hockman, who wrote a piece in this playbook, just put out a very good Substack post about this. There's just not an efficient market for good policy ideas. It's not the marketplace of ideas in a lot of ways is a really inapt way of thinking about how policy change, at least in DC, happens. The cream does not necessarily rise to the top. And so there are a lot of things that you would think are win-win-win, that there are very few interests who are firmly opposed to these geothermal carve-outs, or in even reforming the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which is the bugbear for people in our corner of the world. The environmental review framing law that contributes a lot to these long timelines in environmental permitting. Yes, there's opposition, but increasingly there's not much opposition, or the opposition is starting to be tempered by an awareness that NEPA does not give you the environmental goals that you're optimizing for, and it costs you on all these other axes. But both because of everythingism and because of the fallenness of our world, often very good ideas are widely accepted and then don't get put into legislation and into statute, and then endorsed by the president and off to the races.
It seems like the main blocker on abundant clean energy in the States is just you guys don't want it enough to create regulatory carve-outs. Like it would be quite straightforward in many ways to like set up loads of nuclear power plants and to throw money at more speculative technologies. One other thing that you talk about in the industrial power pages of the playbook is critical mineral production. And that strikes me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, as a slightly harder problem, right? Because so much of these minerals are dispersed across the world. And it is, in fact, China who now controls the supply of them, even to the US.
Yes.
Well, and can I add just into that as well? Do you actually want a war? Because surely it would make a lot of these things easier, right? It would create that rather urgent spur for action.
I am a committed peacenik. I think war is bad, despite my interest in it as an intellectual matter. I think it's definitely true that it's you both have to do what we're trying to do here with the playbook. I think is provide some very wonky, very technocratic, very immediately policy ready proposals that the policymakers could take up. That's a different task, I think, from either broadly socializing these ideas in the broad policy community, or making the case to the American public that it's worth investing in some of these places, or that geothermal is the wave of the future. I think Kelvin's forward does a good job of laying out for a lay audience, here's why we think this stuff matters. But yeah, all of these things are insufficient in isolation. The critical minerals question is one where I think you have kind of the most obvious disjoint between the national interest and the kind of a traditional economic model here. And I don't think you have to be a critic of economics to just acknowledge that because China has immense power over the market at this point, because of decades of investment and cornering the market, there are very strong now business disincentives to open a new lithium or spodumene mine in the U.S. China could, if it chose, dump on the market for months on end and depress your prices and drive you out of business. So, absent federal intervention, there's no obvious path to rebuilding that supply chain through private markets alone. What you ideally want to do is provide business certainty, whether that's through a floor price or through reserves or through building in the kind of financialization and the futures and the infrastructure and the physical capacity for shipping, so that these markets exist. I think and so that you can produce the critical minerals that you need and not be dependent on the country you'd be at war with in a peer-to-peer conflict. There are risks to those kinds of industrial policies, and I think traditional economics has a lot to say about the risks there. You don't want to be on the hook, in particular, just filling in the gap between the market price and the price to keep a lithium mine open if China is dumping on the market for 6 months on end or a year on end. That's a easy way to just spend money on nothing because the Chinese are forcing you to. So I think the challenge for people who are open to or sympathetic to some industrial policy ideas is how do you build out a robust supply chain without creating in that process companies that are just dependent on the federalty in perpetuity.
Well, I mean, that was going to be my question, right? In that, that is China's strategy. So is that not somewhat giving up the battle before you even get into it, right? That China can use these tactics, and I mean, there's a line that I really was struck by in your piece about the hospital preparation, the National Disaster Medical System, where I was saying how these hospitals are run like restaurants, where they're only actually fully staffed at the peak periods where they're expecting a rush. Your granny's coming in because they've got the flu kind of thing, and outside of that, they're operating a skeleton crew, and that has come out of precisely this kind of financialization that you're talking about, right? Where you've chased optimization to pursue achieve these better margins, and it has delivered much better outcomes as a result. But the risk is that when, as you put in your piece, a busload of school children come along at 10 o'clock after the rush, you're just totally swept off your feet. So is there a world where America, to be honest about this industrial policy, has to just go, right, we have to fight China on their own battlefield?
It's a really good question, and I think it's one that lays open the real differences among people who would otherwise agree that great power conflict is real and we'd like to catch up. I think let me try and disaggregate your question into a couple of different pieces. One is just, do we need the levels of state investment and the levels of in the Chinese case, production of a manufacturing surplus for decades that China does. I don't think that's the goal of anybody in this collection. I think that play has had its own problems for China. I think it's been, you don't have to think that efficiency is your end-all be-all goal to think that the Chinese model is remarkably inefficient in a lot of ways, and that it creates this kind of slack in the system that it can use for geopolitical ends at a great cost, economically and otherwise. On the other hand, clearly there are a lot of American systems that could use some slack or could use more surge capacity that don't have it. We saw that during COVID, as I think much of the West did. So I think there is a tension between these two goals, and you have to be smart about which places you're trying to build in this surge capacity or this extra flexibility in the system, and where you're creating just a giveaway to companies, and you're weakening those companies in the process, right? You're making them dependent on the endless federal dollar, and at some point the bill will come due and that money will dry up, and then you're stuck without that company again. The last thing I would say is on the financialization question. Has financialization been the root cause or the root problem, the root reason that we have just-in-time systems for everything? I've been really educated on this point by my colleague Arnab Datta, who has a piece in the playbook on the Strategic Petroleum Reserve about basically there's financialization and there's financialization. Sometimes what you want is actually a deeper market that creates more opportunities for more people to invest, to hedge, and in particular, you want the ability to hedge on physical on commodities. If lithium, the price drops by half because the Chinese pull some shenanigans, you want these companies to have been able to hedge, to have been able to, you want a futures market to exist. You want a whole industry of financialization here, actually, so that investors can build in preparations so that risk premiums for these products are accurately calibrated. There are places where the financialization enables a kind of investment, enables capital to enter a physical investment space that otherwise wouldn't be able to, that traditional investors would look at that and say, we can't put money there. So we'll do more of this on Statecraft, actually. I'm looking forward to getting into it more because it's a topic I've learned a lot about over the last year. But suffice to say, I think you have to distinguish between financial tooling that takes the place of productive investment and financial tooling that enables it.
Yeah, I suppose, yes, there's financialization for risk, and then there's whether your accounting system just makes something that is probably sensible look bad, and then you suffer the consequences because you can't justify it.
Sure. Or even if you are optimizing for shareholder value in a way that means that you should be incredibly asset light, that you should not invest capital in physical infrastructure. There's a lot of ways in which I think contemporary financialization has led to really asset light companies and a push towards avoiding the investment in the spodumene mine, for instance. That may be above my pay grade, but I flag it just to say you want financialization in a lot of places, and good commodity markets that function in part because there's really deep financialization there.
Chaps, we're going to cut for break in a moment, but I do have one more question, which is about lithium, an element you mentioned earlier. There's a classic meme, Santi, about the provenance of critical minerals in America, whereby you guys run out of something or you find yourself in short supply, and then some grinning farmer in buttfuck nowhere discovers some huge resource or something like lithium. And it could be anything really, according to this meme. How much truth is there in that?
I mean, a lot, I would say. And right,
this is a man grinning because he knows his manifest destiny of like conquering the stars.
The new world is blessed, right? And I think America particularly so. I did not wear my grinning America pin for this.
Used all our lithium in the 16th century, I think.
Right, but this is something that I think goes back to the founders and before the English pilgrims are quite aware of the bounteous nature of the continent. I think they would enjoy the meme quite a bit. It would be quite nice to show Benjamin Franklin the lithium meme. I think he'd find it quite compelling. I think this is one of the reasons that the permitting reform piece makes so much sense for us from a policy perspective. Yes, we have all kinds of environmental goals we want to maximize, and I think there's a lot of ways you can do that with quite robust regulation. Like broadly speaking, the Clean Water Act is a success. The Clean Air Act is a success here in the States. At the same time, you want to minimize these kinds of procedural roadblocks that don't give you anything on the environmental end, and make it harder for the farmer in Kansas or in Iowa to, or for the miners who buy him out to take advantage of that remarkable bounty that he's just discovered in the nick of time.
Well, listeners, we've just set up our own X Lab to generate bad jokes. You're seeing some of the early results. We will return with more after the break and a brief word from our sponsors.
Attention, mostly harmless planet residents. Your species appears to have made a slight miscalculation regarding the planetary atmospheric composition. Don't panic. The Society for Technological Advancement cordially invites you to a weather tampering and global thermostat adjustment hackathon, where brilliant minds will attempt to answer 3 simple questions. Can we control the weather without accidentally creating a permanent Tuesday? How do we scale up cloud seeding without angering the local rain gods? And who exactly gets to hold the planetary thermostat remote? While some scientists insist we should focus on not breaking the atmosphere in the first place, we prefer the more practical approach of figuring out how to fix it with interesting technology and hopefully fewer committee meetings. Side effects may include temporary weather, controlled climate, and a small chance of universal prosperity. The SOTA Hackathon, because apparently someone has to figure this out.
Hello, we are back in our the accounting of the podcast puts a few interesting points in the debit side and an awful doom and gloom in the credit. We hope that the second half will be able to improve that balance. Santi, we'll talk now, I think, more specifically about national security, and I know I've been kind of poking you the first half, trying to get a rise out of you.
Impossible. Can't be done.
but we let's touch on some of these other areas, and I think particularly start with like this one about reforming the naval shipbuilding, because you put that stat about well, we mentioned it, that 230 times more tonnage can be produced in China, that the US is, when it produces its warships, 80% of them are over budget and years behind schedule. This is not the behavior of a superpower that is gearing up to win a major naval conflict in the Pacific.
No, or even one that's able to exert power to keep shipping lanes open in the Red Sea, right? I mean, you don't even have to go all the way so far as to say that we're not ready to operate in the nether regions of the Pacific. Suggest that this is a national crisis. We have one proposal in this playbook on reforming naval shipbuilding, and I think this is, again, an overdetermined problem. There are other things that you should do, you will have to do to fix the problem. But my colleague Brian Potter and Austin Vernon is the collaborator on that piece, write about something very interesting. I think is rather metonymic for a broader problem in American state capacity, which is the Navy has for a generation now outsourced design of ships. It used to do it internally the acronym is NAVSEA, was the NAVSEA. I won't try and give you the full name, but was the department that did design internally. And basically, when you separate design, you contract it all out entirely. What you end up often doing, or the Navy has ended up doing, is making design corrections and adjustments once construction is already in progress, which, as you can imagine, is not good. It means that you start over in a lot of places. You waste a lot of time and energy, material, and manpower. The Navy used to be quite good at designing in-house. We've got a historical playbook for how that would work. It's not especially capital intensive, and you get remarkable gains, we think, from spending that little extra bit on making sure your designs are to spec internally. Then I think there's a broader question about what people in the military industrial complex like to refer to as exquisite systems. I don't know if that phrase translates across the pond, but generally the trend in American military capability building has been to make these incredibly exquisite, multi-function, multi-role, remarkably expensive platforms. And the idea is, this one jackknife of a weapon or of a plane can do it all. And I think that if there's a lesson from the Chinese manufacturing push, it's that scale is really valuable, not just on the battlefield, but for actual physical development, that being able to churn out a bunch of less exquisite, less fancy, more single purpose weapons, it's just a lot cheaper and gives you likely more military power at the same or less lower price point.
Yeah, I mean, there's a line that Samo Buya, who came on this podcast, used when he talked about like the intellectual dark age precedes the actual dark age, and he gave it the example of people who, if you'd forgotten how to manufacture swords, you might before that became a problem and the war started, you'd say, oh no, actually spears are better, and so like actually you make a virtue out of the decline of this capability.
Yeah.
It seems, with these ships, right, that producing weapons on time, and as you say, in large numbers, like they've shown in Ukraine, right, where the lifetime of one of these bits of equipment is measured in days or weeks rather than months and years. In a high intensity conflict, you just need to be able to like outbuild the enemy.
Yes.
And I suppose, and that's the same with Britain, right? We've chosen to go into like small numbers of Challenger 2s, and then our Challenger 3 output like shrinks our tank fleet by, I think it's a third or 2/3, but small numbers, high work, like achieve everything.
Totally. It's funny that speared swords analogy is a funny inversion, because in practice what we've done is spent all of our resources on building maybe one very nice M16 rather than 100,000 swords. It is the technology is advancing on paper and maybe in practice, but it's a brittle system. At the system level, it's not up to snuff. The other thing I'll say is, you mentioned earlier that some of these ideas about rebuilding capacity are becoming the new orthodoxy, and that may be true. I'm hopeful that we're winning the intellectual debate, but it is astonishing in Washington. You will have conversations with people about your worries about a protracted conflict with a great power, or about our existing struggles to supply allies in Ukraine, or Europe's struggles to do the same. And often you encounter an idea about American and Western manufacturing capacity that's rooted in World War II, that's rooted in these books like Freedom's Forge, about the really remarkable edge that we had, where we just outproduced the Nazis and the Japanese, despite shoveling, converting our whole economies basically to wartime footing and using this robust manufacturing capacity. And to a really remarkable degree, a lot of people fail to understand that that's China today, and we are in the position that our enemies were 80 years ago. That in any kinds of these serious conflicts, I mean, you don't even have to look at Chinese manufacturing capacity compared to us. Just look at Ukraine, where Russia is outproducing the West in a hot war that exists right now today. So there's, I think, still a long way to go to, I think, bring certain corners of at least the Washington establishment to see reality, that we are in the hole that we like to think of our adversaries as being in.
And there's this repeated thing that I've seen take place when people talk about Russia, is that its economy is about to collapse. There's no way that it could maintain being at these numbers. The numbers coming out of Russia are so bad that any Western economy would have collapsed, right? And I think this brings us on to really the thing that I've been wanting to ask you, and the thing that I've been hinting at is, a country has to have a very clear idea of what its aim is, and be able to say that the country's success or the country's longevity is in this direction, and thus we must marshal all our resources behind this goal. And America's proven itself quite good at doing that in the past, right? And I think that's what these people on the Hill are talking about, that when America gets going, it's pretty good at that. The problem seems to me, and again, this is the sort of touches on the financialization point and the other things we've talked about, is America, it feels doesn't actually seem to be very clear on what its argument is. And, with this case, and I've just touched on another thing in the report of export controls on AI chips, even though, these are supposed to have been in place, there has still been smuggling, right? Because there are a whole lot of people who don't really see themselves that well tied to America. So, if they can make a bit of money off this arbitrage, that's actually great for them.
Yeah. Just on that, the smuggling of chips point, there's a statistic that the IFP team has been rather fixated on recently, which is that one relatively small batch of smuggled NVIDIA chips, of the more high-powered ones, in price is equivalent to the entire budget of the team in the federal government that is tasked with stopping that smuggling. So if you beat us one time, you've already made more money than the entire yearly allocation to the folks on the blue team trying to stop it, which shows you a sense of kind of current national priorities. More broadly, Callum, I wonder if we have a cultural difference here that we're speaking across, where I think the Brits may be a little bit more collectivist in this instinct, and we may be a little bit more individualist. I mean, I certainly think it's important for us to be able to mobilize, or to be able to move to war footing in the event of, immediate crises. But I think my orientation and ours with this playbook is not necessarily to get us there now. It's to say a lot of the tools that you'd want to exist in that world, or a lot of the capacities that you'd want to exist, the manufacturing capacity, doesn't exist right now. And it's not even a question of are we all in alignment that we have to, produce extraordinary amounts right now to beat China. It's almost like a precursor step. We couldn't if we all agreed on it. We would not be able to manufacture, and we're currently not able to manufacture enough to deter, great power rivals. We're currently not able to build out this kind of robust energy grid that we'd like to. And some of this is a recent memory issue. The number of new American transmission lines each year has fallen 90% from what it was in 2013, right? When, in recent memory, even as we're building out quite a bit more clean energy and other forms of energy and want to connect it to the grid, and the hyperscalers are going to demand more energy as well. So to me, it's not so much a question of can we convince the whole nation to mobilize together in the same direction. It's that we've shot ourselves in the foot in a lot of very concrete ways. And the first step would just be to undo those those restrictions and do a little bit more targeting of investment that we like to see.
Wasn't the struggle against Russia what spurred the US to do things like land on the moon? You don't have to go to war with one of these countries for it to propel you to great heights.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there is, as Callum flagged, a question about can you mobilize a society en masse absent, whether it's Sputnik or a similar level shock to the system. I certainly hope you can. I would a war over Taiwan would be a catastrophe, and I would like very much to prevent it if possible. But yeah, maybe this is a little wonky or technocratic of me. I do think there's a lot you can do just at the boring policy level without ever getting to mass agreement that the Russians are going to eat our lunch. In fact, even when you go back to the history of the space race, JFK's push to get us on the moon by the end of the decade is not an especially popular one, and NASA never commands especially high levels of public support, which is in part why the post moon landing, like the generation later, we're nowhere near being able to do it. So I think there's remarkable heights the American project can achieve, even when you don't have kind of like a mass groundswell of support for a given project.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting. I think, yeah, maybe you're right about the cross-cultural thing that America produces things, and as long as you can just about get the incentives right, the flow of capital goes in the right direction. But I think it's an interesting question, and I think we've seen it here in Britain, and I know this is something that maybe we don't talk about too much, but Britain, for example, would struggle now to intervene in an India-Pakistan conflict because of internal tensions that comes from like a diaspora. I'm not necessarily saying America would struggle in a similar way against China. I mean, I think, yes, the Chinese Americans are probably quite well integrated, but I think there's just like an interesting question about, can you summon up a mandate for directional action in the same way in like a country that has undergone the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, which produced like a specific culture?
Sure, I think there are real questions there. I think you can look at the razor thin margins by which presidents win elections in American society today. What we think of as a big win is actually a much smaller margin than a big win was a generation ago, when Reagan won 49 out of 50 states, for instance. So it's hard to find vast popular mandates for anything to the extent that it may have existed previously in American society. There's also without getting too deep into my pet interests, Edward Lutwak, who came on Statecraft a few months ago, has this theory of his that nations with only one child per family don't go to war. The idea being that mothers will not allow their only sons to be killed for any purpose. I think there's a plausible argument that, the mass interest in wartime mobilization is just much lower in a society with many fewer children. Although, in practice, China seems to be on more of a wartime footing than we are, and they have fewer children, and Russian fertility rates are quite low. So there may be strong limits to how far you can take the Lutwakian principle.
Well, Santi, we would love to know what kind of response you guys have had to the playbook, because it's been out a couple of weeks now, hasn't it?
It's been a quite strong response. I think one of the quite good signs is that we've had to do a massive new print order for the book, because in fact we printed quite a few copies and they're gone now. So sign of popular interest, at least. There's a lot I can't, without trying to act all esoteric and mysterious here. There's good signs on specific proposals that I probably shouldn't discuss, but I would say generally the Washington interest has been quite strong, and I think the fact of this kind of strange bedfellows coalition on the project, us and the Foundation for American Innovation and American Compass have all collaborated on something, anything at all, I think has been a eye-opener for a section of Washington.
I note the coyness of your response, and I'm just going to really batter through it by asking you directly what the White House is doing.
I thought I was the brash American, and you were going to just let me off easy here and slip on to another polite topic.
No. What have Trump and Vance, etc., have had to say about the playbook?
Oh, I mean, they haven't said anything about the playbook. I mean, I want to be clear about the limits of our reach here. I think there's quite a lot of interest in the administration in a lot of these ideas, and I think we tried to get this out, pretty early in the administration when, often, right around now or in the last month, political appointees have only just been Senate confirmed, or non-Senate confirmable appointees have only just been gotten through the presidential personnel office process to vet people. And so we're trying to reach a set of folks who are in some cases fairly new on the job and are looking for good ideas. I will also flag, we feel quite strongly that federal R&D and federal science investment are good things, as administration has taken a hatchet to quite a few of them. And I think you have quite a few people in the federal government and even at the heads of these agencies who want to make very clear to the American scientific establishment, no, we really are on your side in the long term. We really do believe in the American scientific project. We're trying to root out the rot, et cetera. And I think a lot of these ideas make a lot of sense in that context. If you've just gone through a very tumultuous purge or a freeze on grant making, there is an onus on a lot of these agencies to show that in the long haul they're supporters of American scientific innovation, not opponents.
And what did you leave on the cutting room floor? What ideas didn't make it into the playbook?
Well, there were some ideas where the three organizations just didn't agree. So we went back and forth quite a bit on tariffs, for instance, at IFP. To paint with a broad brush, we're generally tariff skeptical. We think that it's quite hard to get them to do what you want to do. Our friends at American Compass were, without tooting their horn too much, have had a lot of impact on the more pro-tariff side of the right. So there are areas like that which are clearly related to these questions of, what do you do about China? Trade is a key question there, but we just don't all agree, and we decided to try and put together a product that could stand on its own without you having to take either our line or their line, et cetera. And then there's some other ideas that we thought were very interesting. They're just not quite policy ready enough. You can think of, if you've heard of TRLs, the technology readiness levels. It's a kind of a rough sketch way of assessing how close is a technology to being able to just be deployed and commercialized, et cetera. You can kind of use the same frameworks to think about, is a policy ready to be implemented tomorrow? Are there specific actors who you're calling on to do specific things? And would those specific things mean that the outcomes that you want in the world occur? So there's interesting ideas about charter cities, for instance, that we think are quite interesting and juicy, or ideas about defense procurement that are just not quite ready to be handed to a policymaker who's looking for good ideas.
Well, speaking of cities, didn't you want to put one on the Presidio of San Francisco, this lovely park on the tip of the peninsula?
We did field a proposal that I think was interesting but not quite ready to go. I will hang off endorsing the concept until we get a more fleshed out policy idea.
Well, one thing perhaps we can ask you about is how best to turn a big idea into policy. On this podcast, we speak to plenty of Brits who have big ideas, but it's obviously one thing to kind of yap about it in this kind of arena, and another thing to get it on the desk of senior people, and yet another thing to turn it into actual policy. So what is your advice to would-be policymakers over here?
Well, I will speak in terms of things I've learned from my team. I think advice from me would be rather premature, but I have learned quite a bit from colleagues at IFP, and I think we have had a pretty good track record in the grand scheme of things of getting wish list items into legislative text, into statute, or into executive order. I think one of the key things I've learned is a framing that we use at IFP, which is just that we try to only work on topics that are, as the effective altruist would say, important, tractable, and neglected. I think this is, relatively obvious when you think about it, but a lot of institutions that are not oriented that way. You will be more effective if you're working in a lane that you've got more to yourself than if you're competing in a very dense policy space. I think you guys have had a good eye for guests who are good at the full mimetic stack of a policy idea, not just the white paper. And I think there is quite a robust ecosystem in your corner of the world of, made for public engagement policy ideas that are also policy ready. And I think, despite having a smaller, maybe a less fleshed out policy ecosystem, you Brits actually have quite a good track record of putting together ideas that are, wonky and relevant to the public consciousness. So I think there's probably some vertical integration that's valuable there.
You're being very flattering here, perhaps because you recently got in some hot water for your discussion of Britain. Like, what's your actual opinion of how we're doing?
Oh, I mean, we're very different countries, aren't we? Right? I'm a massive Anglophile. I really am. I in vain tried to convince my wife that we should move to London shortly after we were married, and I lived there for
Really?
summer. Yes, yeah. She's
Why does she do it?
she had a very different educational experience than me, and I think her aversion to the kind of class norms of British society was much stronger than my appreciation for them. Yeah, and she's the better half, so we're here.
You would slot right into the middle class with us here.
Say what?
And everything. Fine. You would slot right into the middle class here. I don't know what the problem is. It'd be fine.
I learned the term recently, the people like us phrase, the PLU. I was not familiar with that until last week.
Yeah.
Well, if you want to be really, really snobby, Santi, you say PLUs.
PLUs.
Or you just say you or non-you when you're talking about something.
Really? What a remarkable people you are.
Cutlery arrangement was non-you.
Well, I mean, this is another schism on the podcast. Is I'm the one calling for a return to like a highly agentic aristocracy. So actually, maybe Santi, you won't like the direction that Britain is going.
I'm not against that. I'm not against that either. I think that it's probably just in tension with my real love for America's folk libertarianism, for the kind of the broad distrust of elites and the broadly shared instinct that one should be left alone to explore the frontier. So I think there's some maybe it's not totally coherent. I think I'm in my own mind. Half the time I'm committed to a project of elite renewal, and half the time I'm saying the demos is correct, and everyone in Washington needs to go pound sand. Still working out how those two pieces relate, but I do have a real appreciation for the American. I guess just like a folk libertarian spirit, and I in particular tend to be quite skeptical of the British approach to free speech, or lack thereof. Well, yes, your tweet that got you into a bit of trouble, and we'd love to endorse it, but we'll already do a knock on the door from Prevent, I think. So we'll refrain from commenting further.
Well, I will just say I think the American First Amendment is a glorious thing, and I would not be chuffed to live in a society without it.
Our lawyers have banned us from commenting on this matter, but on safer territory, maybe we could talk about what a British-themed playbook would look like. Are there any kind of successes that you would seek to accelerate here? Anything that you think we really need to get our house in order over?
Well, given the hot water I've landed myself in with the free speech stuff, and given how the chilly response our vice president got for wading into pan-European affairs here, maybe I should turn the question around. And
we're very proud of our free speech record over here.
Maybe I should turn it around and ask. I mean, what we tried to do with this project, I'm not sure if we succeeded, but tried to focus on American strengths. So where can you take the kind of serious long-termist attitude that Chinese politicians and leaders have taken to techno-industrial development, and where can we adopt those for American strengths? And I think I've mentioned the deepest capital markets in the world. I mean, just incredibly robust innovation environment. I think federalism gives you a lot of strengths in this regard. You really can let 1,000 flowers bloom in a lot of ways. What are the comparative British advantages?
Jeffersonian Maoism.
I will neither confirm nor deny my interest in synthesis here. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, what are the British strengths that a modern British techno-industrial policy would seek to maximize?
Well, we could build on stuff like Biobank, right? Of which you're a fan.
Yes, I think there's. I mean, clearly the British scientific ecosystem is still quite good, and I think there's the sets of data that are available to British scientists, and thanks to the kind of open source nature of the Biobank to scientists the world over, are a real public good in the classical sense.
And just an FYI that you've got a podcast coming up on Biobank, have you not?
Yes, more to say on that topic soon, but I should educate myself a little further before I wade in.
I mean, I think we've covered most things. I think I did have a question lined up about this question of like, do you have to have someone come in and turn the ship and direct the resources of the state in a direction, or is the answer just like make good policy, set up the routes down the mountain, and gravity will do its thing? I think we've sort of addressed that, and maybe we have different views that potentially either come from our different cultural backgrounds or
I mean, there's a middle way that you and I would probably both endorse, right? Which is that you need elite culture that's oriented to this stuff. It's not just a question of Elon popping up, but Doge was a failure, in part because of Elon's foibles and mistakes I think made, right? Like specifically, but also there's the ground was not pre-watered, and there's not necessarily a cultural commitment among other American elites to fixing the state of state capacity.
I think that's probably right. Yeah, yes. If you can win the battle of elite consensus, then it actually you don't need to turn the ship. The tail comes after the head, right?
Something like that. And I think it is always hard in advance to pre-specify. For my big policy project, do I have a great man theory of history, or do I have a populist view, or what have you? In some sense, I think what we try to do here is just outline a set of concrete, very good ideas that are available for someone to pick up, whether that pickup is from a shift in broad democratic consensus or because a specific political leader decides that they're interested in this. But I think the point is to have these tools ready to hand when that moment comes.
I'm curious about the level of plausibility, basically, or kind of apparent seriousness that you take into account when advocating some of these ideas. Yeah, like Callum and I wang on about stuff like turning Dogger Bank into an island and like colonizing. Sorry, I mean settling the British Antarctica territory. Which sorry, I know you're an Argentinian by birth, so perhaps you'll have some pushback on that.
Ethnically, yes.
But be that as it may. I presume that you have to kind of maybe there are some loopy ideas floating around that could actually work, but you have to kind of restrain yourselves such that you look serious. Is that a kind of accurate model of how those conversations might have been behind closed doors?
I mean, I would say it's not so much a question of perception as of being. I think IFP, the phrase we use is counterfactual policy impact. That we measure our wins not by number of pieces published or op-eds or quotes or what have you, but can we tell a very coherent story about policy change that we think would not have happened absent us? And obviously, this is a hard thing to do. You can never be totally sure that you were responsible for something happening or that it would not have happened some other way otherwise, but that's the standard we try to hold ourselves to. And so I think there can be a place for putatively wacky ideas, for ideas that seem well outside the mainstream. But if you don't think they have a chance of actually happening, maybe someone who is less impact oriented should spend their time on them.
Well, and particularly given how fast the Overton window seems like it's moving in many countries in the Anglosphere, actually putting out that wacky idea might be the route to influence, right? You want to be catching the wave rather than being left behind by it.
Certainly, and I don't want my I really love being at IFP in part because of this impact orientation, but I don't want that to be read as saying that people should not, in other sectors, should not dream big dreams and articulate them. And I think there's quite a few different roles that can be helpfully played in a policy ecosystem, and one of them happens to be the really wonky, boring technocratic piece. But I think it's quite plausible that the Dogger Bank proposal happens 50 years from now, and it's because of a key intellectual moment in the mid 2020s.
Well, you did call us sensible and very policy impact and possible policy focused, so we'll take that as a compliment. I will do my own bit of tractable and effective work by taking us out now. I would ask all our listeners, if they are interested by what we've talked about, to search for the Techno-Industrial Playbook, read some of the other ideas that we didn't get the chance to touch on. There are some interesting ones, and I think that are relevant to Britain. It's an attitude to how the state can be reformed to be more effective and make it work for the people of that country, be it Britain or its breakaway province. Listeners, as well, you should also subscribe to Santi's Statecraft newsletter and podcast. We will link all of that in the show notes. If you've liked it as well, check out some of our other episodes that we have mentioned. Share the pod with your friends. Particularly, this is designed to be put in a family WhatsApp chat with a message. Gosh, Dad, I think you might like this. And share it on social media. Other than that, we've got some new episodes coming up soon. Anglo-futurism is going to Parliament. You'll have to wait and see who we talk to. But lots of exciting things. We will say thank you very much to Santi for coming on and talking to us. You've been a pleasure to have up here in the station. And with that, we will sign off. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.
Thank you, Santi.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.